Open up your Bibles, if you would, to Matthew 5. Matthew is in the New Testament. If you're still learning your way around the Bible, there's an Old Testament which starts with Genesis and a New Testament which starts with Matthew. And Matthew is the first book in the New Testament. You're like, why an Old and why New? Well, the Old Testament just simply is before the birth of Jesus, and the New Testament is from the birth of Jesus on. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's kind of a simplified way of looking at it. So we've been talking about how to stand firm and love well in a culture right now that's that repels against difference, a culture that repels against disagreement, a culture that repels against anyone saying, "I don't think that's okay." It repels against that. It repels against pushback in any way whatsoever. And so it can be very intimidating, very scary. If we deal with any insecurities at all, then it would be real easy for us, just to not do anything about it. And so we're going to look at what Jesus did, because I believe we know that He stood firm and loved well. And the thing about it is that people that were nothing like Jesus liked being around Jesus. And He liked being around them too. And yet He didn't compromise, who He is or why He was here. But He was able to do it in such a way that without compromising who He is and yet loving people that were not like Him, He gives us an example of who we're called to be. And so we're going to look at some things that we learned from Him. And so in Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, Jesus said this. He said, "You are the salt of the earth." Everybody say, "I'm salt." Look at the person next to you and go, "You're salt too." Now, I didn't say assault them. I said tell them they're salt, okay? So you're salt too. But what good is salt if it's lost its flavor? Can you make it salty again? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot as worthless. So he starts out, as he's talking with people, he said, look, you're the salt of the earth. Now, you think about salt back then, its role was considerable. It had several things it did. One thing is that they used it to preserve food. We use it today. One of the main things it does with us today is it flavors our food. But back then, not only did it flavor their food, but it would preserve it. Now, I've shared with you before, my great-grandmother, she had salt pork. And I remember we'd go over to her house, and my dad would get buttermilk out of the refrigerator, and then he would get some salt pork, and I tasted the buttermilk, and I'm like, who drinks spoiled milk? And so then I would drink that. If you ever had buttermilk, man, it's gnarly. So, and then he would hand me salt pork. And how many of you ever had salt pork in here? Isn't it aptly named salt pork? I mean, it's like, it's all you taste is the salt. It's like, is there any pork in here at all? I mean, it was the saltiest stuff in the world. It's probably why she died so young. She lived to be 98. But that was probably why. And so it's just one of those things that the flavor was noticeable. You didn't, you encountered that, and it was just a noticeable thing. Another thing they use salt for is that if they would conquer a territory, sometimes they would put salt in the earth and would make it harder for the soil to produce crops. And that way the conquered foe would have to work on, tilling the ground, work harder on it, and less time on uprisings, that kind of thing. And then also there were some healing properties in it. So it was a very valuable spice. And so it was one of those things that Jesus was letting them know that your role here is significant. Your part here is significant. It needs to be noticeable that who you are, who He's called you to be, it's not an insignificant thing, nor is it intended to be neutral. He said, he was telling them, you're called to be salt in the earth. When it's there, we notice it. When it's not there, we notice it. I don't think I think all we have to do is look at a dinner table and see that there is a salt shaker on almost every dinner table you go to recognize the significance of how we view salt and what it does to our own flavor in the foods that we eat. That's who you are. You're called to be salt. You're called to make a difference, to stand out. And then he went on to say this, not only are you the salt of the world, he said, but you're also the light of the world, like a city on a hilltop that cannot be hidden. No one lights a lamp and then puts it under a basket. Instead, a lamp is placed on a stand where it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your good deeds shine out for all to see, so that everyone will praise your heavenly Father. Well, when we think about this, we tend to think about candles or whatever, but actually the light he was talking about was kind of this little oil lamp, and many times it was put in this really fragile clay vase, which I think is a picture of who we are, that we're in these bodies, that that we have the ability to be fragile in our decision making, fragile in the way we stand sometimes, and the choices we make. And yet, in spite of all of that, in spite of all of some of those things that cause us to not be who we always want to be, that in spite of that Jesus said that there's still this light in us, that if we'll let it shine throughout the place that we see, that it brings light to everybody that's in the house. Not just to us, but it reveals things. It shows things. And then also back then, many times cities could be points of reference for navigation that, the further off, you're like, where do we go? You head toward those lights way out there. And because it would say one thing, that if you're especially at night, that's a safe place. That's where you want to be. And so the light that we're called to walk in, it reveals who all of us as human beings are called to be. It reveals who God in His goodness has designed all of us to be. And there's this world out there that many times people have no awareness or no understanding of who they were really made to be. And then also, just like a city would say, this is safe. If you can get here, you'll be safe. That our lives should be that place too, that as we love people, that's that. But here's the challenge that we have, that in our world today, it seems like we have a hard time as Christians getting this right. Getting this right in the world that we live in. I've said before, and I personally believe it's true. It's a point of opinion. So if you disagree with me, I don't care. But so here's, aren't you glad to know you have freedom to do that? So, but the truth of the matter is I believe when I was growing up, that the most significant voice in our culture was a biblical voice. It defined relationships. It defined how we were to treat each other. Now, sometimes the challenge with that is if it was misrepresented, then it misrepresented God to a culture. And so that was part of the challenge it would present. Some things were done in culture, and people were saying that they would use certain verses to validate what they were doing that was obviously wrong, but they were misrepresenting the Scripture at that time. Well, today, the voice in our culture is not predominantly a biblical voice. It is predominantly, I believe, a secular voice. And so in the church world, we do one of two things. We either become so hard and rigid that we stand at a distance and yell at people that are not doing what we believe that they should be doing, or people that disagree with us. That's not appealing at all. Have you ever had somebody yell at you and your first thought is, man, I don't really want to lean into them? Right? I mean, usually when people are yelling at you, like, peace out, I'm out of here. You just want to go. And so that's one stance we take. But then the other stance sometimes we take is that I'm just going to be like them. I'm going to do everything everybody else does. And that's not who we're called to be either. We have such a hard time of getting this right, that there's this calling on our life to be salt. And when you're doing it right, it's noticeable. To be light that reveals God's purpose and God's plan and how we live and in what we do. Not just for us, but it says it brings light to everyone in the house. And a city on a hill cannot be hidden. That is a light that the world should be able to see. And so here's one of the things that Jesus showed us. Number one is this, is that you don't have to be like them to reach them. Now you have to love them. Some people have the not being like them down. It's the loving part that they struggle with. And then the other side, sometimes people have the loving them down, so-called love, but not understanding that just live your life. The example somebody used one time is you could describe the difference between a crooked stick and a straight stick all day long. But the best way to explain it is not to describe it, but lay the crooked stick down and the straight stick next to it, and it becomes obvious what the difference is. That's who we're called to be. To be salt in a world that needs flavor. To be salt in a world that preserves humanity from all the brokenness that it could experience. That there's this preserving factor that salt had that we're called to have too. That's restoring. This thing that God has called us to be, and to be light in this dark world that we're placed in. The world's a dark place. There's just, people are wandering around. There's so much anger in our political discourse right now. There's so much anger in how we see people that disagree with us. There's so much anger in all of those things, and yet light is supposed to reveal how we should respond in these situations. So number one is this, is that you don't have to be like them to reach them. Go with me, if you would, to Luke 19. Now you're in Matthew, and Luke is 2 books over. There's Matthew and then Mark and then Luke. Matthew was a tax collector that followed Jesus. Luke was a physician, and he became a Christian, became a Jesus follower. And so this is his account. He said he did much investigation, much research on this, and this is what he wrote. So here was one of the situations that he saw with Jesus, or heard about with Jesus. Luke 19, verse 1. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. Some of you may refer to him as a wee little man. And so there was a man there named Zacchaeus. Thank you for those laughs. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he had become very rich. He tried to get a look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree beside the road, for Jesus was going to pass that way. And when Jesus came by, he looked up at Zacchaeus and called him by name. Zacchaeus, he said, "You rotten sinner, what do you think you're doing here with everybody else? How dare you make those decisions that you're making? Do you know that the judgment of God is getting ready to come upon you? Do you know that I should have nothing to do with you because how horrible you are?" How many of your translations read that right there? Everybody got that? That's the religious translation, okay? This one mine says, Zacchaeus, he said, "Quick, come down. I must be a guest in your home today." Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. Why were they displeased? He's gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. Anyway, meanwhile Zacchaeus stood before the Lord, and he said, meanwhile, while they were grumbling about him, while they were doing not one single thing for his soul, not one of them gave a flip about how broken he was, how he'd gotten to that place. While they're back there grumbling, he's standing before Jesus, who had reached into his world. And he said this, "I'll give half my wealth to the poor. Lord, and if I cheated people on their taxes, I'll give them back 4 times as much." Jesus responded, "Salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost." Who did he come to seek and save? Lost people. Who's lost? Anyone without Jesus. You know, the word lost here, this is what it means by definition. Something ruined. So Jesus came to seek and to save those who were ruined, either by their own decisions or the decisions of others. Wasted. Those that feel like their life has been wasted. Trashed. Those that feel like their lives have been trashed. He came to intently seek people who feel like they're living a ruined life right now, a wasted life right now. He came to intentionally seek those who feel like they're living a trash life right now, devastated or destroyed. You know, it's so interesting. We can see what people do, but we have no idea the broken places on the inside of them that have taken them to that point. And so while the others were grumbling, Jesus was at his house connecting with him. And as long as that connection went on, at some point Zacchaeus said, "I'm changing." This is what we learn from Jesus, is that connection comes before correction. It's easy to stand from a distance and yell. But when you begin to invest and interject in somebody's life and begin to walk with them along their broken way, at some point you win the opportunity to speak into their world. So many times we can be real heavy on the correction end and real light on the connection end. But there's something powerful about connecting with another human being right where they are. Not expecting them to come to you, but going to them where they are, and literally and figuratively in their world. And connecting in that moment and just watching that happen. Something that kind of happened to me today was just very special for me. As I was ministering, I saw a man sitting on the back row, and I didn't recognize him. And so, as I walked out and I was standing out there, and as I was shaking hands at the door, he came out to me and he said, "Do you recognize me?" And I knew that it was like I felt kind of drawn to him or whatever. But I'm like, "You look familiar." And he said, "It's been 40 years," and I'm like, "Well, then no, I probably don't recognize you. I know I haven't changed in the last 40 years, but as we were talking, when I was headed towards getting an education degree, I was doing some coaching on the side, and I was coaching at a junior high at Lewis and Clark in Tulsa, and he actually played football for me when he was in the 7th grade. And so he said, you had an impact on my life, and I mean, it was a 3-month season, 3 months. But for whatever reason during that season, the Lord used that moment to impact his life, and so he drove from South Tulsa to be in church today. And so, I appreciate that, but I'm not doing that because I'm like, I remember how I coached, and I'm kind of really surprised that God did anything with it, but it's one of those things that we get so short-sighted sometimes. We can't see past this moment. And we make decisions that can either invest and realize that as we continue to put seeds in people's hearts and give God opportunity and time to work with them, and for that to grow and develop. 4 decades later, he was in church. 4 decades. I know it's surprising some of you didn't know I was 40 years old. But here's the thing. Kidding. But so many times we get so short-sighted, and I think we lose sight of this, that there's just something about connecting in people's world, and again, not being like them, but connecting and loving them while we stand firm with who God has called us to be. If the church would get hold of this, it would just be so powerful. I love Pastor Mike. One of his things that he's always really big on, that if you work with students, if you were to work Wednesday night before correcting a student, he'd want to make sure that you know their name. What do you know about them? Because it's real easy to come in and tell them what they're doing wrong because they're teenagers. But to connect at that point, then we begin to journey together. One of the reasons why we want to be relentlessly good is because we realize that there are people in our world today that have heard things about the church that they want nothing to do with the church as a whole. And some of them have been wounded by the church. But we realize even those that may be in this season of life that have shut their ears off to our message, that being indiscriminately good to people is a message that even they can hear. It's something that even they can connect with. So you're going to go in your world tomorrow, and you're going to encounter people like the Zacchaeuses, who among his own people was viewed as a traitor. They were despised. And you think about the place that Jesus was in, that on this road as he's traveling, that there's this crowd lining the road. It's so huge that Zacchaeus can't even push his way through. He can't even see over the crowd. And the popularity of Jesus at that time was so huge that he climbed up in a tree so he could see him. And of all the options that Jesus had of people that would have gladly had him in their house today, he invited himself into the one house that many of them wouldn't have invited him to. Just this awareness. And I don't know what the conversation was in Zacchaeus' home. It doesn't tell us that. But it just says that he said, I'm going to go. I want to be a guest in your home day. And it says Zacchaeus quickly climbed down. I mean, he climbed down from the tree and he took him to his house. And somewhere, that trip to his home and somewhere in the conversation, that while Jesus was connecting with his heart, connecting with Zacchaeus' life, that it made such an impact on him that Zacchaeus' story changed to the point that he said, I'll give half my wealth to the poor. If I've cheated people on their taxes, I'll give them back 4 times as much. And while they grumbled and complained about who Jesus was with, he said, salvation has come to this home today. For this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost, ruined, wasted, trashed, devastated, or destroyed. You think Jesus stood firm? Absolutely. You think he compromised just so Zacchaeus would feel more comfortable? No way. And yet on the other hand, there was a connection that took place as he sat down and ate with him. There's, especially in their culture, and even today, there's something very intimate about sharing a meal with somebody in their home. And the religious people at that time thought he was validating by being around them, that he was like, you're validating what he's doing. No. I'm connecting with them because I came to seek those who feel like their lives have been ruined by the decisions they've made. Here's what we learn. This is our picture. Number 2, connection comes before correction. Let's look at number 3 and we'll close with this. Let's go with me, if you would, to John 17. John 17, you're in Luke. John is the next book over. John 17, verse 14 says this. Now, Jesus is praying right here. He's praying. This is just before he's arrested and put on trial and then whipped and beaten and then put to the cross. So it's in the Old Testament, as the high priest was getting ready to offer up the sacrifices, many times they would spend all night in prayer, and Jesus was getting ready to offer himself up as a sacrifice. So we'll even talk about that here in a minute. And so it was symbolic of that. So in verse 14, he said, I've given them your word, and the world hates them because they do not belong to the world. They're talking about the world's system that the enemy was behind. Just as I do not belong to the world. I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but to keep them safe from the evil one. Let me read that again. I'm not asking you to take them out of the world. I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but to keep them safe from the evil one. They do not belong to this world any more than I do. Make them holy by your truth. Teach them your word, which is truth. Now listen to this. Just as you sent me into the world. So Jesus was sent into the world by the Father. Just as you sent me into the world, I am sending them into the world. And I give myself as a holy sacrifice for them so they can be made holy by your truth. So just as you sent me into the world, I'm sending them into the world. So Jesus said, look, I was sent here. I was sent to seek and to save that which was lost, to intentionally, purposely pursue those who have been ruined, devastated, just all of those things. He said, purposely to do that. He said, just like I was sent, I'm sending them. Now, I began to think about this, that we have examples of people that are sent just kind of in the natural. I want to give you a few pictures here. Like right here, here's a picture of just some military personnel. They're sent places, right? And then there's, let's give our military a big hand. We're just grateful for them. And so, but they're sent to places, sent with an assignment, sent to do things. And when they go there, their impact is not neutral. And when they're doing their mission right, the ultimate goal, the ultimate outcome should be for the betterment of where they're going, right? And so, but imagine if they showed up and just were neutral to these chaotic situations, to these places of destruction, or even worse than that, we're not neutral, but engaged with those that were and began to create chaos as well. I mean, be like, oh man, what are you doing? So we know that when they go, they're sent with instructions that are purposeful. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. Sometimes they feel unwelcomed or unvaluable, but it doesn't change what their role is. Here's another group that we send. And so our law enforcement, let's give our law enforcement a hand. We're grateful for them. But they're sent to places. They get calls and the dispatcher gives them instructions and says, look, I want you to go to this place. And imagine if they showed up at a crime scene and somebody's robbing something, and instead of neutralizing the situation and apprehending the suspect, what if they came in and go, hey, here's another bag, fill it up too? I mean, that would be like a bad thing they'd be committing to the crime. Or what if they were just indifferent to it and said, we're not going to stop that if somebody was being violent or whatever, we're not going to interrupt. No, when they go, they're sent with instructions and directions to do certain things in that situation. They can't be indifferent. They can't be neutral to those things. They have to be involved and they have to engage in order to bring about the work that they're sent there for. Here's one other group, and that is, our firefighters. We think about them. Let's give them a hand. We're grateful for... But again, they're sent to certain situations that are chaotic, where things are going on. Sometimes, in any one of these roles, you can be misunderstood. In any one of these roles, sometimes you can be unappreciated. But what if these guys showed up with cans of gasoline and they began to pour it on the fire? You're like, what are you doing? It doesn't matter. I don't want the people to set the fire to be upset with me. No, man, they show up to change those circumstances, to create an environment where people can thrive in again and be safe. We get that. Tomorrow, some of you go to a job that you don't hate, and you're like, why am I here? Because you were sent there. Tomorrow, if you go to school, you're going to be dealing with situations, sometimes not appreciated. Especially, I know you teachers many times that you deal with situations that people don't know the sacrifices you've made, and they make silly statements about the commitment that you have, and you can feel so unappreciated in that. And yet, I want to remind you, as you already know, you've been sent there to make an impact, to push past people's ignorance, to push past their not knowing, to push past all of that, because Jesus, just like He was sent into the world, He sent you. Whatever your role is, whether you work outside of the home or your responsibilities are in the home itself, or whatever your role is in the community, whatever your role is in the church and in your neighborhood and with people that you're around, that just like Jesus was sent, you and I were sent for a purpose. And so many times we get caught up on how much longer will this be, as opposed to, Lord, what is it you want to do through me here? Lord, why was I sent here to this uncomfortable place, to this uncomfortable situation where people don't value what I'm bringing? If they would just, they would just get it, if they just understood it, that the difference I would make in their life. But in spite of that, just like Jesus was sent and sometimes people didn't value Him, sometimes people made it harder for Him to do what He was sent here to do, that it didn't change the fact that He was sent. And in spite of whatever was going around Him, just like when the police show up, in spite of whatever's going around them, they have a purpose when they're there. Just like our firefighters, they have a purpose when they're there. That we as Christ followers, that when we show up, we can't get distracted by all the other peripheral things, but we have to cling to the fact that you were sent in that place right there, and this is our purpose. And while there may be those that on the outside will criticize what God has called us to do, that while they're criticizing, just like they did Jesus, that in people's lives that there's real change taking place. Because we know we were sent. That's what Jesus showed us. I mean, I go back to that and it goes, He said, I'm going to come down and go to your house, and people were displeased. They grumbled meanwhile, which while they were grumbling, this took place. And then right here, Jesus prayed this prayer: don't take them out of the world, but keep them safe from the evil one. And while you're doing that, He said, just as you sent me into the world, I'm sending them. You've been sent. You've been sent to where you are. Tomorrow when you go there, it's purposefully. It's on assignment. You're sent, just like He was. Just like He was. Number 3 is this: we are sent for a purpose. You're sent for a purpose. For a purpose. Endure hardship as a good soldier. Persevere because you were sent for a purpose. Why am I here? Because He sent you. He sent you. You're there for Him, for His purpose. To love people, to be a light, to be salt. Not to be like everybody else, but in standing firm, loving well. what God has called you to do. Let's do this. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes for just a minute.